Now look, Word in Your Ear comes to you at least once a week in the form of a podcast, a video cast, or a thing so new it has no name. And it's free. All we ask is that you subscribe, like, and wherever possible, leave a comment. And if you feel like getting further involved, you can become a Patreon supporter, which could mean you're inviting us to rifle through your record collection, are inviting you to join us for our very special Friday night quiz, and all of us feeling the sum of human happiness has been increased. Details at patreon.com/wordinyourear. And now on with the show.
Welcome to this edition of Word in Your Ear, another book about Dylan, about Bob Dylan, but this with a compelling and unexpected angle, which is that Dylan is the author's father, which is mapped out in some detail in Boy from the North Country, and it's written by Sam Sussman. Sam, it's very nice to see you.
Hi, Mark. It's great to be with you as well.
And now, David and I first heard of this story about what the premise of this book when you wrote an article in Harper's Magazine in 2021. Now, why did you decide to write that article then, telling us this story? We'll come on to the story in a moment. But why did you decide to write it in 2021?
Well, I think every writer has certain experiences that are formative, and that if you really want to become the writer that you're trying to be, you're going to have to face on the page eventually. And I'd spent my 20s writing about other subjects, writing other novels, writing all sorts of things. And, you know, this book, the essay I wrote for Harper's was really about two things. First, my mother's relationship with Dylan, and growing up with the ambiguity of whether I was his child. And secondly, being with my mother at the end of her life, which was, for me, an enormously formative experience. And, you know, after her death, I knew that you're putting your hand up, so I'm going to stop and let you ask a question.
No, I was just going to say, I think we must get you at this point to tell us chronologically the story. Now, your mother, Fran Sussman, met Dylan in, was it 1973? Explain the
74.
circumstances of how they met.
Well, it's a wonderful story. Let's talk about for a second. They met in Norman Raeben's painting class. For those who know about, you know, Dylan 70s lore, Dylan credited Raeben with being the person who turned him out of personal and artistic crisis and into the songs that became Blood on the Tracks. My mother was 20 years old. She was dropped out of Bennington College in Vermont, had come to New York to become an actress. She was in Raeben's class. And one day Dylan walked in. And, you know, Dylan, as you people will know, this was not for him a pleasant moment of his life. He was in personal and artistic crisis. His marriage was unraveling. He felt that his best work had been done in the first half of his 20s and that he hadn't written anything as good as Blonde on Blonde since it came out in 66. Which, if you think about it, is sort of a terrifying position to be in as an artist, right? To be in your early mid-30s and feel that your best work has been done in the first half of your 20s.
And he hadn't toured, had he, either, actually? He hadn't toured.
He had toured in 74 for the first time, actually. In the first 3 months or 4 months, whatever it is, he had toured for the first time, but he hadn't enjoyed the experience. And he wasn't happy with the music. Raeben had a reputation as a painter who used painting to help artists who worked in other forms return to something essential about their work. And Stella Adler, the famous mother of method acting, sent actors to Raeben's studio all the time for this reason. So Dylan wanders in one day, and Raeben had a practice that students would go around and comment on each other's work. So the first time that this happens with Dylan, People just say, oh, your canvas looks like your lyrics sound, that kind of flattery.
Because they obviously all recognised him, and everyone
Oh,
knew
of course,
who he
no.
was. Yeah, yeah.
Of course. This is 74. I mean, Dylan's wildly famous. I mean, as discontent as he might have been with his own work, he's one of the most famous musicians on the planet. So that's how other people are responding. And then it comes to my mother, and she says, I describe this in Boy from the North Country, my book. She says, your composition is off, your colors are harsh. This isn't a worthwhile painting. You've got it wrong. And Dylan loves this because he hasn't come into the painting class to be revered as an artist. The only reason that he's in that painting class is that he's in a moment of artistic crisis, right? And so their relationship began from there. And there's also a good story of, I can tell it. So he comes up to her after class and he says, why don't you host a party for the class? It doesn't make any sense. She lives in this third floor walk up in Yorkville, Manhattan, and he's Dylan. He can rent any restaurant, any hotel room. Why is she throwing the party? So she throws the party, and Dylan is Dylan. He's standoffish. He's hard to talk to. And about 2 a.m, the last guest leaves, and he closes the door with a press of he's wearing red cowboy boots. He slams the door, and it turns to my mother, and he says, well, that was boring. And that was the beginning of their relationship. And, what I've written in Boy from the North Country is the story from my mother's perspective of Dylan writing himself out of this artistic rut and putting together the songs that become Blood on the Tracks. And he would write that he'd come over to her place, which is now my apartment, and play the song one way and then another. And I mean, something she always talked about was just how much of a struggle it was for him, that he was never satisfied with his own work. He had no sense of self-satisfaction as an artist. And famously, as we all know, he recorded Blood in September 74, and then tore it up and went to Minnesota and recorded the songs again 3 months later. And he would call her from the road, and he would be out of town and say, play that song one more time, and he'd have a different way of playing it. And
so all those details in the book are from your conversation with her. That's all those details, the way it's all mapped out, and the conversations are all exactly what she told you.
Yeah, and look, it's published as a novel. I'm not going to claim that there's not one single detail that's not imagined, but yeah, the account is drawn from my mother's description of being with Dylan at that period of his life.
And at what age did she tell you all this, or did it come out slowly?
And let me just say one other thing. I mean, look, there's dialogue. It's a novel, right? I mean, it's me telling the story as she told me the story, but I'm not a Dylanologist, and we see Dylan from her point of view, and I try to be very clear about that. My artistic ambition here was not to write the definitive account of Dylan writing Blood on the Tracks, right? It happens to be one of the most intimate accounts that's been published, but I'm not a historian of Dylan. And people have described this as one of the most moving mother-son stories. And for me, that is the heart of the story. It is about a mother and a son coming to know each other and the experiences that have shaped who each of them are. And it's about the mother recounting these experiences of her youth.
And she strongly believes, doesn't she, that there's a particular 2 verses in Tangled Up in Blue, she lit a burner on the stove and offered me a pipe, and all about the Italian poet from the 13th century. That's something that specifically happened in the apartment.
Oh, of course, and that's a great story, which is that one night in '74, summer of '74, Dylan is at my mother's place, and she lights a burner on the stove, and she offers him a pipe, and she read him Petrarch. Dylan loved it. Was completely taken by Petrarch. Came back to her place a few days later and had read all the Petrarch he could get his hands on and wouldn't stop talking about him. And it's fascinating because people have speculated that must be Dante, right? 14th century. And Dylan was asked once, and he said, "Oh, it's Plutarch," which is so Dylan-esque because Plutarch's from the 1st century. Right. But that's Dylan. He doesn't care. Right. And also he knows that he's influenced by Plutarch and Dante and Petrarch. Right. And when my mom when Dylan played the song to my mother, she said, if you're referring to Petrarch, you've got the century off by 1. And Dylan said, "Oh, okay. No, but he didn't change it." And I think, in a way, that's such a view into who Dylan is as an artist, right? I mean, people say to me, "Oh, so that song's about your mother." No, the song's not about my mother. The song's not about one person. Dylan is taking these experiences that he's had in his life with many women, with many people, and he's transposing them into music. If he was just recounting the experiences of his life, he wouldn't be a very interesting artist.
So she was, to some extent, obviously a sounding board for this record. And you describe how the relationship lasted a while. He would suddenly just turn up often unannounced, or he'd ring and say he's got to come round, and he would stay the night. And then after, how long was it before the split, as it were?
It went on about a year, and then my mother ghosted him. Changed her number, stopped returning his letters. And look, let's be very clear. And I have been from the beginning of the time I've written this story in Harper's and now as the book Boy from the North Country. He was involved with many other women at this period. He was still married.
I think he had an affair with a girl at Columbia, didn't he? Ellen Bernstein, I think.
Ellen Bernstein. There's an actress he was involved with at this period. This is Dylan. There have always been many, many women.
So your mother must have been aware of that.
Oh, of course she knew. Of course. And, she was during the period of that period of their relationship, she was 20 and 21. And, she came to a point, as she described it to me, where she said, he could give me love songs, but not love. And that, I think would have been very apparent to anyone who is in that situation. And, when she was talking to me, she first told me these elements when I was a teenager. And, of course, my first thought was, what? You broke up with Bob Dylan? Are you kidding me? That's just sort of unfathomable.
No, let me just stop you there.
Of course, let me just say, but of course, as an adult, you just think about it and realize, right, to me, it became a point actually of great admiration of her, that she had the self-knowledge to know this was not, that he was not available, of course, as a loving partner.
But why did she decide? What made her decide to tell you about this when you were a teenager? So she'd not, up to that point, you'd had no inclination that she'd known Bob Dylan.
Yeah, well, that's another line of the story. Well, when I was a teenager, I had a teacher first who said to me, you look like this musician. You should look him up, listen to his songs. And I did. And, like tens of millions of other teenagers, I thought the music was fascinating and I listened to the music. And then one day I was in the car with, and I should say, I was listening to the music. Other people would mention to me, "Oh yeah, by the way, right, Dylan, do you know this musician Dylan? You look a bit like him." Okay, that's interesting. What teenager doesn't like to be told that you look like, some cultural icon? And then I was in the car one day with my mother's partner at the time, and Dylan's song came on, and he said, there's a line in there about your mother. And I thought, what? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's not the sort of, the idea that my mother knew Dylan was like, that she knew Shakespeare, right? I mean, that wasn't, to me, I wasn't even thinking about him as a person at that time, right? I mean, I was thinking about him as an artist, but I was listening to music that had been made, 50 years before. I was listening to the early stuff, the 60s material.
But then she told you, again, this is relatively recently, that she'd also met up with Bob Dylan again in 1990. And that was 9 months before you were born. So at this point, you started to take a different view of the story and think about something more specific.
Yeah. It's not that recent, by the way. I mean, these conversations were when I was a teenager, which is, almost 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
But yes, right. So she gradually started sharing more. First she said, no, I didn't know him. And then it was, yes, I knew him, but a long time before you were born. And then she said, well, I met him a long time before you were born, but we saw each other again. And then she wanted to tell me that they had seen each other a number of times in the late early 80s and early 90s. And yes, then of course the story took on a different dimension, but she did not say more to me at that period of my life when I was a teenager.
Did she want you to think that Bob Dylan was your father?
No, we're talking about when I was a teenager, when we were having those conversations. No, she never went further than to say that they had been involved and that they had seen each other in that period of time.
Which was 9 months before you were born. But you never asked her, did you, specifically to confirm whether he was or he wasn't?
Oh, of course I did. No, I've written about that. Absolutely. No, that's in the book. And she didn't want to. And part of the book, part of Boy from the North Country, the book I've just written, is about me, and this is true in the Harper's essay as well, me coming to understand why she didn't want to talk about that and why she wanted my identity not to be rooted in that and why she wanted me to become my own person on my own terms. And, she talked at length about one of the reasons that she left him was that she didn't want to be a footnote in his life, right? And I think from the outside, people look at it and think, oh, well, I mean, who wouldn't want to be in that situation? Who wouldn't want to claim this connection to a cultural icon? But, no one wants their life blotted out by that kind of sun, right? That sun with a U. And, look, we were talking about this before we came on air. One of the many, many reasons that I've written this book as a novel is that it's, again, my project is not about defining Dylan, right? My project is about becoming a person and an artist on my own terms, right? And it's completely apparent to me why my mother didn't want to say more about that when I was a teenager and how that would distort a life. And
she must have thought, she must have thought that you had assumed or suspected that Dylan was your father.
Suspected, yes.
And how was that when you started to think that he might be? How did that make you feel about the person you were?
Well, it was a range of emotions, and I wrote about it at length in the book. I think when the idea first came into my head, of course, they're mostly positive emotions, right? Wonder, awe, wow, this must be a sense of destiny. I mean, here I am, a teenager in a sort of small town in a rural part of, upstate New York. And, what better model could you have of someone who wants to leave behind their small town and move to a city and become an artist and have a more expressive life than Dylan, right? But, once the possibility became slightly more concrete, it wasn't just positive emotions, right? It was also a sense of, well, everything I know about myself might in fact be other than I think. That's not a pleasant thing to experience. And you know, right, yeah, but so much of the book is about the ways in which that feeling led me to leave home and, pursue my own life as a writer and an artist, and then come back as an adult.
But in an ideal world, Sam, in an ideal world, wouldn't you like to know for certain? I mean, obviously a DNA test or whatever is impossible, but in an ideal world, wouldn't you like to know, yes or no, whether Bob Dylan was your father?
What I've written is that the way I understand myself is as my mother's son. And for me, that's where the story ends. And I understand other people that might not satisfy everyone else. I understand that. But, for people who are taken by Dylan, what I have to offer is a highly unique account of his music and him as an artist and, the portrait of him riding blood. And, and so a friend of mine who loves Dylan read this and he said, I love that material, but you haven't given us a definitive answer, and that's not satisfying. And I said to him, I quoted to him, the Dylan line. I said, I'll give you my heart and you ask for my soul. And, I don't think it changes anyone else's understanding of Dylan as an artist, of, me answering that question. And I've written at length in Boy from the North Country why and how I came to feel that was the wrong question in my life, and that the way that I've understood myself
I'm still fascinated by this idea that
through the woman who raised me.
Yeah, but if you're considering the possibility of Dylan being your father, you're also considering that you might have whatever it would be, 5 or 6 half brothers and sisters. I mean, that's how do you feel about that?
Well, many more than that. Let's be realistic.
Yes. No, I was just trying to be cautious there.
Yeah, well, it's a good subject on which to be cautious, and I'll be cautious as well when I say I'm certainly not the only person who has raised these questions. There have been many relationships, and I think, well, I'll stop there.
But I just want to ask a couple of questions here. That you've just come back from doing loads of literature festivals, and you've been book tour all over United States and the UK and so forth. You're presumably signing copies of the books. Have you started getting used to looking down the line of people waiting and spotting the kind of Dylan anoraks, as we would call them in the UK, queuing up to kind of get a close look at your face? Have you had that experience?
Yes, but it's not really what I'm thinking about.
But it must happen to you. It must be a curious thing to happen to you.
People have all sorts of reactions. People come up to me and say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you look so much like Dylan. You're the spitting image." And then other people come up to me and say, "Oh my gosh, you don't look like him at all."
Right.
And it's look, but that's the fun. But I write in Boy from the North Country
to some extent invite that comparison, because the way you have your hair, and very like the cover of Blonde on Blonde to some extent. I mean, you are inviting people to make that connection to some extent.
Oh, I'm not complaining about it, and people have told me that I look like him when my hair is shorter and longer, and that's when I look at my hair, frankly, it looks a lot more like my mother's hair than his hair. But that wasn't a complaint in the slightest. It's just to say, on those reading lines, look, the book is also about my experience of being with my mother at the end of her life, and many more people come up to me on those reading lines and talk about seeing in the book a reflection of their own experience of loss and grief, then talk to me about Dylan, to be completely honest with you. And I think there's something universal in this story, which is that it is a story of understanding who our parents were before they were our parents. It's a story about coming into an adult appreciation and understanding about who our parents are. And many, many more people talk to me about that than anything else. And that's what's been very meaningful to me. People sharing their own experiences of loss and grief and caretaking of a loved one at the end of their life. And to me, that's the spiritual heart of the book.
Right. Do you play music?
I don't play music. People tell me that I should. Yeah, no, I don't.
Well, because if you did, presumably a record company will be on the phone to you now. So let's make a record. You haven't had that kind of approach.
My language is my music. My writing is my music. Boy from the North Country is my music.
Right. Fair enough.
Yeah, but I think Dave's point is it'd be very easy to get a record deal if you wanted.
If you wanted a record deal,
because everyone would be so interested. You know?
It's a good position. It's not my art form, but I'm
no, understood. Understood. And obviously, again, you have no real idea whether Dylan is aware of. Well, he will be aware of this book, I'm sure. But when you wrote the article in Harper's, they had to go to Dylan's people for fact checking, and they didn't want anything changed, did they? So but then again, had they commented on it, had they asked for a change, it would have drawn attention to the fact that your case might be different from various other cases that they would have been presented with. Is that right?
So, right. I mean, they asked to see the piece in advance, and came back and said no changes requested, no comment in the piece. And of course, I won't say too much, but they had every right to object to anything that they thought was not a faithful account.
Well, it's a fascinating book, and anybody interested in, as you say, in the relationship between somebody and a parent towards the end of their life would be fascinated by it. Anybody interested in Bob Dylan, that period around Blood on the Tracks, during his kind of creative block, and that story of the relationship with your mother would also be equally fascinated. Sam, it's been very nice to talk to you. Good luck with it all. It's called Boy from the North Country, and very much available now.